and welcome. You're watching NewsX World. I'm Megha Sharma and let's take a look at the top stories of the hour. The Ukrainian president is headed to Paris to meet the European allies as the Russian President Vladimir Putin vows to press on in Ukraine. Leaders are holding talks to firm up contributions to the planned security guarantees to Kyiv. NATO chief Mark Rutte has said that Russia did not have a veto on whether Western powers can deploy troops to Ukraine as part of security guarantees if a truce is reached. Russia remains firmly opposed to any Western troops being deployed in Ukraine. After Russia, China has now made it clear that it is not conspiring with North Korea and Russia against the United States of America after the US President Donald Trump accused the troika of the same. Russia's Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong were in attendance in Beijing at the invite of Chinese President Xi Jinping to commemorate the 80 years since the end of World War II. The death toll from a funicular derailment in Portugal's capital Lisbon has risen to 17. It has left 21 injured. 11 foreigners were amongst the injured in the accident that took place in a popular tourist spot on Wednesday evening. Chinese President Xi Jinping and his North Korean counterpart Kim Jong are now meeting. The meeting has concluded. Kim Jong is on a visit, and it's a rare foreign visit to China, where he was attending the commemoration event of the end of the World War II at the invite of China's President Xi Jinping. The Trump administration has asked the US Supreme Court to expedite its appeal of a ruling that struck down the president's sweeping global tariffs. The request came after the US Court of Appeals ruled that Trump had exceeded his authority by invoking emergency powers to impose tariffs on virtually all US trading partners. India has slashed major goods and services tax rates from the existing four-tier structure to just two tax slabs of 5% and 18%, effectively reducing the cost of consumer goods and household items. The move is seen as a tool to offset the impact of the 50% tariffs imposed by America on Indian exports. The Israeli defense minister has vowed to inflict biblical plagues of Egypt on Yemen's Houthi rebels after they stepped up their missile attacks against Israel. A missile fired from Yemen struck outside Israeli territory today. This after the Israeli military had intercepted two other missiles fired from Yemen in the wee hours of Thursday. Big story of the hour, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to hold a one-on-one meeting with the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff today as diplomatic and strategic efforts intensify. This latest information comes as the Ukrainian president arrived in Paris for high-level talks with his European allies on security guarantees in the event of a peace deal with Russia. The summit brings together the coalition of the WWII, which is a group of European states ready to provide long-term security support for Kyiv. Guarantees under discussion include enhanced training for the Ukrainian army and possible deployment of European troops. Joining me on the telecast is Andrew Latham, who's the Professor of International Relations. He's joining me from Minneapolis in America. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me. And of course, the big point of contention has already been raised by Russia and a retort by the NATO chief ahead of the coalition of the willing, the meeting that is going to take place. The number one point of contention is the security guarantees and the troop deployment that the Europeans have vowed for support and security of Ukraine if at all there is a peace deal that has been struck. Do you think this is something that is actually going to happen, is practically possible in wake of questions being raised by Russia, which continues to refuse and accept any of such security guarantees that the Europeans at this point of time are discussing?
Yeah, well, several points that are worth underscoring, one of which is that Ukraine is still a sovereign nation. And if it wants to invite foreign troops in whatever capacity onto its soil, it can. Now, whether that's wise or prudent, in other words, whether they should do that, that's a different question, politics being politics. I will say, too, that if we look at the example of Korea in 1953, a temporary ceasefire was agreed that has now persisted for almost, well, around 7 decades. But that ceasefire is backed by 28,000 American troops providing security guarantees to the South Koreans. And so we have an historical example in which a ceasefire, not a permanent peace, a ceasefire can be sustained over decades, but it requires security guarantees. There are some security guarantees north of that demilitarized zone as well. So it seems to be a key ingredient for the kind of ceasefire that we're talking about, and yet it is totally unpalatable to Putin and his coterie, who see it just as NATO expansion by other means. What happens if a French or British troop soldier gets involved in a tussle with a Russian soldier across the demilitarized, what would be the demilitarized zone? How would that escalate? It's fraught with all kinds of really negative possibilities. And from Putin's perspective, it's just NATO expansion, as I said, by other means. Will it happen? I imagine now, since both parties, all parties, are so invested in this, they'll find some way to fudge it, find some way to pretend that they are getting what they really want. One thing is for sure, there will not be 28,000 American troops deployed to Ukraine as part of this security guarantee.
Talking about what President Putin has said in the span of the last 24 hours, he said that if Zelensky is interested in a peace deal, he should come visit Moscow and hold those talks, or else Putin is going to deploy brute force to end the war. There has not been a significant, strong response that has come thus far from President Trump after that reaction. President Trump, in fact, has said that he is hoping for a peace deal to be signed between Ukraine and Russia. This is what he continues to say. What do you think are the implications of this? Do you think Trump at this point of time has become more docile with regards to the peace deal between both the countries, especially after his meeting with President Putin in Alaska?
Yeah, I think he just wants a peace deal. And I don't think from Trump's perspective, he really cares how that shakes out. He would like a better relationship with Putin, if for no other reason than to drive a wedge between Putin and Xi Jinping, especially after the SCO summit a few days back. But he doesn't see any real American interests in Ukraine, notwithstanding the minerals deal that's been done. On the other hand, he has a vested interest in appearing not to throw Zelensky under the bus. So on any given day, at any given hour of any given day, Trump is making different noises. He's sometimes very pro-Zelensky, sometimes very pro-Putin, sometimes somewhere in between. But what we can say is a constant is, and I'm not sure I would put this down to his desire for a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not sure that I want to go that psychoanalytic route. But what is constant is his desire to get the fighting to stop and to claim some kind of credit for that. As I said, on any given day, he's courting Zelensky, he's pressuring Zelensky, he's courting Putin, he's pressuring Putin. Maybe it's all boiling down to what he's had for breakfast that morning.
All right. Andrew, stay on with me because there are more updates on this story. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova earlier made a statement in the daily press briefing. She said and expressed Russia's position on the security guarantees sought by Ukraine. She stated that the security guarantees that the Kyiv is seeking to pose a threat to the European continent. This statement comes as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is holding talks with the European leaders, with the central issue of the discussions remaining the security guarantees for Ukraine. Meanwhile, both Ukrainian and Russian forces continue to maintain active front lines amidst ongoing talks about a potential meeting between the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. Actually, in fact, listen in to what the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson had to say.
Что Россия не собирается обсуждать в корне неприемлемую и подрывающую всякую, любую безопасность иностранную интервенцию на Украине в какой бы то ни было форме, в каком бы то ни было формате. Идеи киевского главаря, которые являются, по сути, калькой инициатив европейских спонсоров, даже не спонсоров, а Европейской партии войны, как мы уже не раз говорили, носят абсолютно неприемлемый характер. Они направлены на сохранение Украины в качестве плацдарма для террора, для провокаций против нашей страны. Они являются гарантиями небезопасности Украины. Они являются гарантиями опасности европейскому.
Andrew, do explain to me, especially when President Putin was in China, in Tianjin, he was attending the SEO summit, and there were two big statements that came from him. He said that he legitimized the Russian offensive against Ukraine, pointing out, number one, the reason for Russia to strike Ukraine was, first of all, Ukraine's desire to be part of NATO, and the second of all, the coup d'etat that took place in Ukraine, in Kiev. How justifiable are those reasons that have been given by Russia to fight Ukraine?
Well, there's a third one too, which is his claim that the post-2014 Ukrainian regime was persecuting Russian speakers, especially in the Donbass region. So there were three kind of rationales. The Maidan Revolution back in 2014, there are various interpretations. I don't think it was a coup. I'm not sure that everybody was playing by the rules, but I don't think it qualified as a coup. But it certainly was a change of direction. The previous government had been very pro-Eurasian orientation for Ukraine, and then the subsequent government saw Ukraine as part of the West and aspired to European Union membership, but more importantly, NATO membership. Now, since the end of the Cold War, we've seen the creep of NATO eastward, including, by the way, to incorporate former members of the Soviet Union, the so-called Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And at each time this has happened, the Russians have said, thus far and no further, we're drawing a red line. And then NATO expanded, and the Russians would say, no, we really mean it this time. Do not expand anymore. And NATO would expand again. And it is, of course, the sovereign right of the countries that were joining NATO to join NATO. That's international law 101. But it didn't look that way from Moscow. So I think there's more credibility to the narrative that Putin was spinning around NATO expansion and has been spinning for a long time, rather than Russian imperialism or any the 2014 change of government in Kyiv. I think that has been a long-standing Russian gripe. It has been perhaps a source of legitimate concern on the part of the Russians, although I think it's vastly overblown. NATO is defensive, not offensive. So I wouldn't give too much objective credence to Putin's narrative, but I think it's a narrative that he actually buys into and is motivating him and the people around him to a significant degree.
Also, talking about the coalition of the willing, there's yet another meeting that has been organized, which is taking place in Paris. Do you think any substantial, tangible actionables are going to come out? Are there key outcomes that are going to come out of this meeting? Or until and unless there is Trump that is in the picture, there's nothing that the European allies can really do to stop the war or initiate a peace deal?
The European allies, of course, are divided. NATO is not going to act as NATO, but the French and the British, and perhaps one or two others, might issue some proclamations. But I think it's going to be at the level of rhetoric. I don't think British troops and French troops are going to deploy without at least some sort of blessing from the United States government and Donald Trump. I just don't see that happening. It has to be said, too, that the British and the French don't have much in the way of military forces that could be reassuring to anybody these days. Generations now, post-Cold War, budget cuts and reductions in their forces have left them in a less than optimal position, especially against the battle-hardened Russian army. They're there as a tripwire. If they were to be deployed, they would be there as a tripwire, which is to say, if Russia would have to think twice about continuing or violating a ceasefire because it might kill a French soldier or a British soldier, and then who knows what would happen. Would that violate Article 5 of the NATO treaty? Would that incline or initiate an escalatory spiral? And who knows where that ends? The British and the French, to remind your viewers, have nuclear weapons. Russia has nuclear weapons. And we never quite know, as the Cuban Missile Crisis taught us, and as the Berlin Crisis taught us, and as a few other incidents taught us during the Cold War, you never know where a fairly minor development can escalate into and take us to the brink of nuclear war. That's both a deterrent for Putin, because he doesn't know either how that escalation, but it's also an invitation to brinkmanship. Nobody wants to blink. Nobody wants to back down. Everybody wants to win. And who knows then when you're going to cross the red line inadvertently.
All right. Thanks, Andrew, for joining me, sharing your views. I'm going to move on to the other big development. According to reports, Japan and America have now neared a deal to implement lower tariffs on Japanese automobile imports, with the reduced rates set to take effect within 10 to 14 days after a U.S. presidential executive order. The tariff rate would fall from the current 27.5% to 15%, according to Japanese state media. Moreover, Japan's top trade negotiator, Rossi Akazawa, has traveled to Washington to urge prompt issuance of the executive order. The order is expected to include adjustments to ensure the new 15% rate applied consistently to Japanese car imports, along with provisions on expanded U.S. rice imports and purchases of U.S.-made aircraft. This revised deal is part of a larger July trade agreement, which also includes $550 billion U.S.-bound investment package from Japan's government's own banks that comprises equity, loans and guarantees. The two countries are finalizing deals to swiftly execute both the tariff cuts and investment plans. On the telecast with me to discuss this is Yoji Koda, who's the Vice Admiral. He's a retired Vice Admiral of the Japanese Navy. He's joining me from Tokyo. Thank you very much. And what do you make of the latest developments of a possibility of reduced tariffs on Japanese automobiles from 17.5% to 15%? Do you think there's a possibility of further negotiating the tariffs down between America and Japan?
That's what Japanese hope. But, of course, Mr. Trump and the United States, they have their own position, and Japan has our own position. And, Mr. Akazawa, he was the cabinet minister in charge of the trade and tariff negotiation with the United States. He visited, I think, the United States 7 or 8 times before. And of course, reducing the automobile tax and the tariff down was one of the major subjects, especially Japan has been so much insisting on that, but Trump administration always said, no, 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 no. And after, I think, a month-long staff-level negotiation, Mr. Akazawa finally visiting the United States, perhaps for the last time. So what does this 1 month-long staff-level, the negotiation means? Perhaps there could be some compromise. And, of course, the U.S.-Japan relationship is not only the tariff or economy. That's not my field, but also the security, And the security side, there are so many things Japan has been making a contribution that many Americans do not understand. For example, the location of Japan. Japan's geography really contains Chinese naval forces and air forces within the Sea of Japan, the East China Sea, South China Sea, and mainland. There are island chain of Okinawa to Taiwan, and Taiwan to Philippines and Indonesia to the Singapore Malay Peninsula. And all of these, the territories are not Chinese territory. And Japan has been playing a major role to block. We call it choke point. So China may have many carriers, perhaps, but it's not easy for China to get out from there to fight against the United States. Or,
Right.
so this is Japanese contribution. Also, please think about the distance between the U.S. mainland to the Taiwan. More than 10,000 kilometers. Hawaii, perhaps 6,000 kilometers. From Japan, less than 2,000. And huge, overwhelming U.S. forces would be or could be deployed in case of the real contingency or emergency, like the President Saddam Hussein invaded into Kuwait. That's a typical case.
Okay, but keeping our focus on tariffs and a potential trade deal, there were discussions that had been held in July. The key contention questions that had been raised by Japan was adopting protectionist measures when it comes to its rice growers, agricultural sector. There has also been a condition that has been put by the American administration for Japan to buy more U.S. aircraft. Do you think these negotiations, the demands that have been made by the U.S. administration could be accommodated by Japan? And would that negatively impact the domestic economy of the country?
Oh, no. First, perhaps the rice issue, that should be separated from all the other agricultural issues. And rice, yes, Japan had some chaotic situation, especially in the sales and the price of the tax in 2 months ago. But that's kind of the short duration, the impact. And now the rice is stable, and that means Japanese rice supply is not fewer or much fewer than the demand, the market demand. So and all the other agricultural issues or aircraft, that could be manageable. And the Japan is still the largest, the customer of the Boeing, for example, and far larger than the France or Europe. They buy the Airbus, and Japan is, except some, the A350s for the Japan Airlines, that's only 9-10 aircraft, but all the others, hundreds, we are purchasing from Boeing. And almost all the Japanese food supply, more than half are coming from the United States, some from South America, Argentina, Brazil. So, these areas are not so life or death matter for the future negotiation, and it's manageable. So key is still, they're on the automobile, the tariff issue. That's what I think. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining me and sharing your views. I'm going to shift to my focus to Gaza, and the Israeli Defense Minister Katz has threatened Iran-backed Houthis of response of biblical proportion for the recent attacks on Israeli airport. The Houthi military spokesperson Yahya Sari had earlier claimed that the Yemeni rebels targeted Israel's Ben Gurion airport near Tel Aviv using a ballistic missile. This comes as earlier the Israeli army had reported that a missile fired from Yemen struck outside Israeli territory. Listen in to what the Houthi military spokesperson said earlier.
نفذت القوة الصاروخية في القوات المسلحة اليمنية عملية عسكرية نوعية استهدفت مطار اللد في منطقة يافا المحتلة، وذلك بصاروخ باليستي نوع ذي الفقار، وقد وصل الصاروخ إلى هدفه بفضل الله.
Tensions continue to rise as conflict between Yemen's Houthi rebels and Israel escalate. Professor Ephraim Inbar, he's a senior researcher at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He's joining me from Jerusalem. Thank you very much. And, there has been a sustained effort by Houthis that continue their missile attacks on Israel. What do you think is going to be the Israeli response, even as it keeps its focus on completely obliterating Hamas and of course the push that has been supported by America of Netanyahu's plan to completely uproot Gazans from Palestine and shift them elsewhere?
I think the Houthis are a problem, a strategic problem, not only for us, also for the Americans, the Egyptians, every country that wants free navigation in the Red Sea. The problem for us is that they are 2,000 kilometers away, and our ability to project power at such distances is limited. Even the Americans basically made a deal with Houthis, and after a few months of fighting them, decided to end the combat against the Houthis for a limited agreement, not to attack American ships. And we don't see the Egyptians or the Saudis ready to join the Israeli efforts to put an end to the Houthi rule or to the Houthi attempts to interfere with the freedom of navigation. And we do what we can. And this is, sometimes it is significant as the last attack. Sometimes it is less significant because Yemen is a country with not too many valuable targets. And they are therefore less susceptible to pressure by doing damage to their country. And we'll have to live with it. After all, their ability to create damage in Israel is also limited. They send once in a while a missile, and which is usually intercepted by the Israelis. It is some headache for the Israeli population that has to move from its regular life and go into sealed rooms. Yeah. But otherwise, I think this is something that we can live with.
Okay, all right. There have been 2 attacks that have happened consecutively in the last 12 hours against Israeli territories from the Houthis. What do you think is going to be the action plan of the Israeli Defense Forces with the political will to ensure that these attacks are curtailed and a decisive counter-action is taken by the Israeli military forces against the Houthis?
First of all, I don't know. I'm not privy to the secrets that are being planned in the Ministry of Defense and in the military. But I think that we should be modest in our objectives. Hopefully other countries will wake up. Unfortunately, the world is not fully aware of the strategic threats by the Islamists, by those fanatics. And we are left alone. To some extent, we feel alone fighting the Hamas in Gaza, another fanatic Islamic group. And I think that we'll try to collect enough intelligence, valuable intelligence in Yemen in order to respond in such a way that will raise the costs of the Houthi elite to attack Israel. But they are very devoted to the cause. They want to destroy the Jewish state, like all the radical Islamists. And they have great religious motivation. And it is not easy to face such an enemy. Unfortunately, Israel is surrounded by many of such groups. And we try to minimize the damage they are causing to us and exact a higher cost from them. So that's the only thing we can do.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor Ephraim, for joining me, sharing your views. On that note, I slip into a short break. Stay tuned on NewsX World for more news and updates on the other side of this break.